Is there an evolutionary reason for people to hear a story, song, or any other narrative and care? For example, Elvis Presley's In the Ghetto is a sad song, but it's fictional.
Yeah. What the exact reason is, we're going to have to work at the level of hypothesis here.
Yeah.
Let's put it this way. I'm going to define empathy in a way that many people would claim I'm defining sympathy, but it has to be defined this way for reasons that matter. Empathy is the capacity to figure out what another individual will think, feel, and do based on you taking the data of their experience and running it through your own calculator, right? In other words, if I, the person who wrote the question about their significant other who died at 33 from COVID and or vaccine injury, I can put myself in their shoes and I can know an awful lot about how they likely felt based on the fact that anybody, any human being in that situation, anybody who's lost somebody can imagine the shock, especially somebody young and somebody very, very close, right? The thing about empathy, though, is it is inherently indifferent to whether or not the person whose mindset you're trying to understand is on your team or not, right? You could empathize with Hitler in the bunker as the Russians are descending, and you know why he killed himself, right? Because he didn't want to be exposed to the punishment for what he had done, right? So obviously Hitler is the ultimate other team, right? But understanding his mindset is not impossible, right? You can pretend it is, but it's not. And you need to be able to, you will fight your enemies much better if you understand what's in their heads and how they feel about it. And you will do so based on using your own mind and putting yourself in their shoes. So here's the point. That works when you have a lot of analogy with the person, right? So, I know your mind very, very well for lots of reasons. We've been together forever. There's that. But you and I also grew up at the same moment in history, in the same city, traveling in the same circles and schools and things. And so the point is, I have an awful lot of information about what's in your mind. And then there's a bunch of stuff I can't get because I've never been a woman. And so how do I deal with the stuff that I can't get? Or in the case of a Maasai herdsman, how am I going to get into that person's mindset when I don't share any history? Well, I could read a story about a Maasai herdsman, right? Or I could read a story from the perspective of a woman that would allow me to sort of, groove those particular thought processes. And then I'm not going to be as good at it as I would with somebody that I grew up with and, is, male and had, similar experiences, but I'll be a lot better at it than I would be naive, right? So basic point, the punchline, the answer to your question is, I think, in order to do the job well, you have to have the same shorthand in your mind that exists in the person's mind you're trying to understand. In other words, emotions are how we decide what to do and what not to do. And therefore, we have stories that allow you to teleport into a mind that isn't going to be intuitive to you. And if those stories are really good, right, if they have the verisimilitude to do the job, then the point is you've got to be run through the emotional state as well as just the calculations in order to see why they feel this way and not that way. Yeah. And so the point is, it's not surprising that a fictional story that is well written would teleport you enough into this mind that you would have the experience as if the mind was a real thing, because you're effectively running an emulation of it in your own.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. You're effectively running an emulation. One of the things I was prompted to think while you were talking was how many features of humans have been invoked as, that's the difference. That's what makes us human. Famously, it was tool use for a while. And then it was, making war. And it's been bipedality. It's been language. And I haven't actually seen it written like it's theory of, it's been fire, it's been cooking, right? I haven't actually seen it written that it's theory of mind, because anyone who thinks about theory of mind carefully and doesn't have a completely human bias knows that other organisms have theory of mind, but we obviously have it much, much more developed. But I'm wondering if, it's not useful to look for the character that makes us human. That's not what humans is. That's missing the point of human at a lot of levels. But that the extent to which we are constantly running an emulation in your language, which is theory of mind, ability to understand that some other individual with whom you're interacting can feel a different way about a situation about which you also have an opinion, is something that all humans do. And that's what running an emulation is. And maybe just that. And so obviously then, I don't actually know this particular song, the Presley song in the Ghetto, but music, narrative, theater, poetry, all of it is, can I see through their eyes?
Yep.
Right? Can I sit where you're sitting? Can I walk in your shoes? Can I understand you well enough to feel what you are feeling? And as you say, to some degree, even the end of life of Adolf Hitler is understandable.
It's understandable.
And that is completely different from saying, I feel for him.
Right. No, don't you dare.
Don't you dare. Don't you dare feel for that man
yep.
at that moment, right? Maybe as a 5-year-old. But the emulation that we run is, we do it far more and far more complexly and far more frequently than the other organisms like parrots and crows and elephants and dolphins and chimps.
Yep.
And baboons who have theory of mind.
Now, there are two final points on this, I think. Mm-hmm. One, it is surprising how well you can do this with an animal that you know, right?
Like not a species, but a pet.
Right. Well, no, you can work backwards. If you have known, many cats, right, you can sort of get a sense for how a cat might view a circumstance. Mm-hmm. It's vague, and it's never going to be at the level you can do it with your own species, but it is surprising. And it's also mm-hmm. interesting how important, I think George Schaller, the behavioral ethologist who studied lions, failed with great apes. Mm-hmm. Jane Goodall succeeded, in part because Jane Goodall broke the rule established by men who had gone before her and allowed herself to empathize with her subjects rather than try to be a robot and to see them through purely objective eyes. And the point was,
also, I think one of the big distinctions that both she made and that Gene Altman, who was working at a similar moment, but who was less famous, and Altman was working on baboons, was actually, we're going to look at these as individuals. We're not going to kind of do this like it's a population, it's chimps or it's baboons. And, one of Altman's significant contributions, which no one outside of primatology probably knows who she is, but one of her significant contributions to animal behavior is the concept of the focal watch, that when you're trying to figure out what organisms do from a scientific perspective, you go out and you have an animal. And, you should know in advance, who they are, already know who the population is. Don't say, oh, that guy's doing something interesting, I'm going to focal watch him. But, watching one and then seeing who interacts with them, as opposed to, I'm just kind of going to watch the whole thing and see what happens, you're going to miss many of the details that individuals go through.
Right.
So it's another individual versus population level difference. And that's one of the things I've been thinking about this week. So I think it's fascinating.
Yep. Well, it also, the population doesn't have a mind that you can empathize with in the same way, and the individual does. And, the farther an animal is from a human, both in terms of, an elephant is fairly close to a human in terms of what it is and does. It's not at all close to a human in terms of phylogeny. Mm-hmm. But nonetheless, the thing with chimps and gorillas, and to a slightly lesser extent, orangutans, is your toolkit for understanding how an individual would view something is actually, it's crude, but it's on target, right? Mm-hmm. The emotional range is there, and the same kinds of things result in the same sorts of emotions. So anyway, you got to be very careful not to project something that isn't there, but when you're cat is happy, right? You can tell when your cat is dismayed and when your cat is obsessed with hunger, Fairfax.
Or squirrels.
Right. And, you've got to let yourself test the hypothesis that, yes, actually, I am in that animal's mindset. Okay. But the other sort of final point here is, all right, you run an emulation of another person. Let's say you sit down with somebody you've never sat down with before in your life, but you know something about them and where they grew up and what they've done for a living and how large a slice of history they've seen and all of that, right? And you can do a certain amount of emulating. Okay, now a friend, somebody you've known for years, you've spent many, many hours in conversation on all sorts of topics. You can do a much higher resolution version. Then a family member you've known your whole life, an even higher resolution version. Okay, now one of those people dies, right? The person you've just sat down with for the first time, you may feel bad that they're gone, but probably you don't have a rich enough emulation that it persists. But as you get closer and closer, as somebody becomes more and more important to you, the richness of your emulation of them goes up and up and up. And one of the outgrowths of that is that when somebody dies, your emulation of them is actually the most real version of them in existence, right? The memories of all of those who knew them well and the various emulations that they have running in their heads, that is not, it's concrete, it's real, it's neuronal activity, and it's emulations built of actual experience with an actual idiosyncratic person. And so I think the person weirdly lives on in a very real way in your mind. And I take a kind of comfort in this, right? So my grandfather, for example, sometimes I'll be looking at something that I know either he saw or he didn't see, but would like to have seen and would have had thoughts about, or maybe he would have been dismayed to see it. And I sort of feel like I'm letting him look at it because I know how he would react. I'm letting the emulation of him interact with the world since he died. So anyway, I don't know.
That's great.
It's a interesting topic.